vida, bajo la garra de un homicida. Si te pones lo que...
Hola, bienvenidos a Cuarto de Hora, el programa de Cadal TV. It has been 10 years since Oswaldo Payá and Harold Cepero died in a suspected car accident in Cuba. It was an accident or it was a crime. It was July 22, 2012. Payá and Cepero were with Ángel Carromero, an Spaniard, and a Swede, Aaron Montlick. Carromero was a delegate of New Generations, the youth organization of the Spanish Popular Party, Partido Popular, with Montlick was the president of the youth of the Swedish Christian Democracy. Give Me the Liberty is the title of David Hoffman's latest book, and it is about Oswaldo Payá and Varela's project. A challenge to Fidel Castro with an unprecedented nationwide citizen petition for democracy. The project was named for Felix Varela, a 19th century priest and philosopher who was Cuba's most illustrious educator. David Hoffman is a contributing editor to the Washington Post. He's an expert on the Cold War. He was correspondent in Jerusalem and Moscow, Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction in 2010. He wrote several books. The last one is precisely Give Me Liberty, the true story of Oswaldo Payá. Welcome, David, and thank you for these 50 minutes with us.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Give Me the Liberty is a famous speech of Patrick Henry delivered on in St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia. That was in 1775 when the American Revolution was brimming with. His words was, which electrified the audience, ended with a well-known phrase in your country, in the United States: give me liberty or give me diet. Why did you choose this phrase for this or this speech for the book about Oswaldo Payá?
You know, Oswaldo Payá struck me as a man with the kind of dedication that Patrick Henry had to an ideal. And you see, I spent many years in Russia. You saw in Andrei Sakharov also this incredible single-minded dedication to a simple idea. And I visited Sakharov's little cottage in the woods in Nizhny Novgorod, where he wrote his famous declaration. And I thought often that millions and millions of people in the Soviet system saw it was a repressive system. But Sakharov alone stood up to the system and said, I challenge it. And in Oswaldo Payá, I saw the same thing. It was no secret in Cuba that the revolution became a dictatorship. And millions of people saw this and felt the same things that Oswaldo felt. But here was a fellow who personally lived his entire life in that dictatorship, by the way. But he was willing to stand up against the sort of implacable wall of the authoritarian system and say, give me liberty.
Give me liberty. But Oswaldo paid a heavy price for the liberty, or what he said, liberation.
He did, but you have to remember that this fellow, having lived the experience of the Castro Revolution, he learned a lot of lessons in those years, and it forged his determination. Some people said he was sometimes a lone wolf, very solitary. And I think his road was a lonely road, but it changed him, and which, as the years went by, he thought even more urgently, not about how to issue press release or make a fancy statement, but how to really cause change in a place like Cuba. And there were many other dissidents, but what was really unique about Oswaldo is that he thought of a way to change the country, to mobilize people for that change. And this was the thing, by the way, that worried Castro, because Castro believed he was the only person allowed to get 1 million people in the square. You know, he was going to be the maestro of the masses. Oswaldo Payá motivated people to sign their names on the petition, their address, and their identification number. He got 35,000 people to stand up against the dictatorship. So I think that one thing is that during his whole life, he increasingly, through trial and error and through hard work and with great personal sacrifice, threats to his family, constant pressure, he didn't give up.
He collected signatures door to door, well, that was great. But do you think the Varela's project died with Oswaldo?
No, not at all. And I should remind people that, you know, going door to door was not some sort of like act of altruism. This is not the salesman going door to door. This is a person, in Oswaldo's case, prohibited from speaking on television. He had no access to radio. He could not write anything in the newspapers. Everything was controlled by the revolution. The only voice he had was the voice he could muster, the persuasive voice he could have, going and talking to people and saying to them, we have a right to rights. And there's a very important thing Oswaldo said. I think it was most important. He told people when he knocked on the door, he said, we have to be the protagonists of our own history. We can't just be the spectators. And so people said, what can I do? How do I be the protagonist of my own history? Oswaldo reminded them that this citizen petition that he was asking for signatures was in the Constitution. I think Fidel Castro had maybe ignored it or not paid close enough attention. But Oswaldo had a genius idea, and that was to use the law of the state against itself. He would say to people, this petition's legal. It's in our Constitution. That caused people to lose their fear. And at the time, Oswaldo said to them, we must mobilize for our rights and ask for them. And many people raised their hands in this familiar L for liberation all over Cuba. And, you know, the reason that I think his legacy is still strong is even today, even this very day as we speak, there are protests on the streets of Cuba. People are hungry. They're protesting what's happened to the country. And everywhere you see this.
So the new generations know Oswaldo's works.
I think if you see them out there on the streets, like holding up their hands like this today, Oswaldo, if he were here, would say, these are the children of the Varela Project.
The question is, what could he think if he's been alive today?
Jorge, you know, the Varela Project was a simple piece of paper, folded halfway, room for some signatures. Oswaldo's weapon was a pencil and a piece of paper. You know, 20 years later, we have the digital revolution. Everybody in Cuba has a smartphone. We have ways of communicating that are much better. And frankly, we see in Cuba that this is actually accelerating the demands for change. So the methods that Oswaldo had and his courage were actually very simple and very direct. But today, things have grown much more complicated. The means of communication are actually much more fluid, but also the dictatorship is still there. It's resilient. It fights to hold on to power. Fidel Castro's gone. Raul is very old. The charisma and the sort of entire movement feeling of a revolution at the beginning is completely gone.
But do you think something changed after the death of Fidel and the period of Raúl, and now with the presidency of Díaz-Canel?
Oh, I think there's no question. Cuba right now is going through a period of terrible hardship, shortages of food. There aren't basic medicines in hospitals and pharmacies. There are electric power outages every day. People are marching at night, banging pots and pans and holding flashlights. Conditions have grown as bad as they were in the early 1990s in the special period. And so I think people have lost patience. And because the great icon of Fidel is gone, the glue maybe that held it together for a while doesn't hold it together anymore. And I think Cuba's on the edge. It's very much on the edge.
Oswaldo was a leader?
Oswaldo was a person who understood mobilization, how to inspire people. But he oftentimes said, I don't want for myself. I want for all of us. You know, he admired Lech Walesa, the great Polish shipyard worker who led the revolt against communism in Poland. But Lech Walesa tried to end communism with the round table. Do you remember? Everybody sat around the table and ultimately it ended. Oswaldo wanted to try that, and the Cubans would have nothing. You know, we don't want a round table. We want change. And this is the thing. Oswaldo found the way to reach the Cuban people that nobody else had. So I think that made him unique and as a leader.
July 22, it was an accident or it was a crime?
I would like to divide things up into two categories when I answer you, because we know for sure that the car that Oswaldo was riding in with Harold Cepero in the back seat and driven by Angel Carromero and with Aaron Modig in the front seat also, we know that car was rammed from behind by a car driven by Cuban state security. It wasn't a crash. They were shoved from behind. As a result, Carromero lost control of the car. This much we know. Now, what happened after that is there are many open questions. The car hit a tree, according to the official Cuban account, and this is what the Cubans say, the government says, caused Oswaldo's death. But there are lots of unanswered questions. We do know that by nightfall, Oswaldo Payá and Harold Cepero were dead. And the two Europeans were taken from the car right away by people who appeared on the scene out in the middle of nowhere. Very suspicious, a lot of suspicion. So when Carromero was put on trial by the Cubans, and he was accused of reckless driving and put on trial. And in the trial, the official Cuban government trial, there was no mention at all about the car being hit from behind. They covered it up and whitewashed it. And that, to me, is the most telling thing of all.
Did you talk with Carromero and Montlick?
Yes, I interviewed them both at great length, and they're quoted in the book at some length.
And you are in touch with Oswaldo's daughter?
Oswaldo's family helped with this book a great deal. And Rosa Maria now is the founder and leader of an important group called Cuba Decide, which advocates for rights in Cuba. So the family provided many of the archives, Oswaldo's writings and notebooks, and their recollections. So I cooperated with them closely.
As you wrote in your book, Oswaldo was an engineer who specialized in medical electronics, and his great passion was to change Cuba. Do you think Cuba will change?
I think that there is no question that over time, the system that Fidel Castro created is unsustainable. It's not, in this day and age, I think that where information moves quickly, the Cuban people want and deserve better. And more and more of them are saying that they want better. You know, the great promises of Castro's revolution, of free healthcare and education, of prosperity and equality for all. Well, if you visit Cuba today, you won't find much left of that. And the Cubans only have to look around them in this world to see nations that are far more prosperous and free and ask themselves, why not us? Cuba's pursuit of freedom has been underway for 120 years. And I think that at some juncture, the end of this dictatorship has to come around. And the thing is this, Jorge, there are many people outside Cuba who would like to bring this about. But I think Oswaldo said it best. He said, if we want this change, it has to come from within. It has to be our change. And I think that's very, very true.
David, you mentioned the Stasi in your book. They are still using that kind of methods in Cuba?
I went to the Stasi archives, and in the book I describe how a Cuban state security officer came to the Stasi University in Potsdam and was trained by the handbooks and the methods of the Stasi for repressing dissent. These were very specific methods. The Stasi always had a goal ever since the 1950s of trying to preempt dissent, of trying to figure out who was unhappy, who were the dissidents, and reach them not through violence and coercion. They could do that, but they would much rather find a way to subvert them, to undermine them, to carry out psychological warfare against them. And these methods were taught to the Cubans, and many of these same methods were the ones they used against Oswaldo Payá. They would smear him, they would threaten him, they would threaten members of his family, they would try to disrupt his efforts at organization. They tried to falsify the signatures in the Varela Project, but Oswaldo caught them.
Hope something change in the near future. David, thank you very much.
Jorge, thank you. I hope people get to read the book, and I want to show the cover of the book. And I hope people can read it. Okay.
Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you.
Y así pasó por cuarto de hora David Hoffman, autor de Give Me Liberty, Dame la Libertad, que es lo que pide Cuba. Nos reencontramos en la próxima. Chao.
Una sociedad condenada bajo la oscuridad, sometida bajo la garra de un homicida. Si te opones lo que él determina, te encarcela o te aniquila. Desde hace mucho tiempo tiene